So welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today as we hear about how you can work with mainstream media and the mysterious parliamentary lobby. And as I mentioned, for what is also sadly our very last Boost webinar. But in this session, our fantastic speakers, who I'll introduce properly in a moment, will first look at how environmental organisations can engage effectively with mainstream media, including the process for working together with journalists and tips on crafting the right language and framing for your messages. From there, we'll move on to demystifying the parliamentary lobby, looking at how lobby journalists operate on a daily basis, why engagement with them matters for environmental organisations, and reflect on the trends and changes since Labour came into government. So to introduce our speakers, we're delighted to be joined by Ben Jackson, who is a director at the Climate Centre and brings a wealth of experience for today's discussion, including a role as environment editor at the Sun newspaper. And our second exciting speaker is Steph Spyro, who is the Deputy Political and Environment Editor at the Daily Express, and equally brings lots of experience to the discussion, particularly around the parliamentary lobby. So we'll hear presentations from both of our speakers to start with before we head into audience Q&A for the final 20 minutes. And as usual, before our speakers begin, can I please just ask you all in our audience to pop your names and organisations into your Zoom profiles. And we are also recording this session and we'll be uploading it to our website. So a big thank you to Ben and Steph for being here. And Ben, I'll pass over to you to start us off.
Thanks so much, Nadia. Lovely to be here. I have to say, joining a call with Steph is great today because I think the Express have come out with one of the most sensible stories I've seen in a long time, where Boris has said we need to stop bashing the green agenda because it won't win votes, and just concentrate on cheap green power. And I think if there's a thought we can hang on to, beyond this briefing, it is that is true, that bashing the green agenda in the end won't win votes because it's not logical for people in the long term. So really delighted to be joining this call with Steph. Very quickly, Climate Centre puts people on media. This week we put an hurricane expert out on BBC PM, on Sky News, and on Channel 4. We've put out an op-ed on insulation by an Oxford professor. We've had an expert in vertical farming in the news, and also the head of science, the RHS, on the state of Britain's gardens. So that's what we try and do, is trying to anticipate and help support the media to get these stories out. And as Nadia said, my background is that I'm, for my sins, former environment editor at the Sun during a period under James Murdoch when they were able to be quite pro, and that was bookended by the sort of travesty of COP in Copenhagen and the high watermark of COP in Paris. So hopefully, I think, just as discussed with Steph beforehand, I mean, journalists need our support, right? It's tough. So this might be a useful way to think about how we can help them, as well as help them help us in terms of getting stories in the media. So Nadia, if you could just pop to the next slide, that'd be great. So this is basically, I guess, maybe a brush up and a way to push our stories up the agenda where possible. But as you can see, media is quite a lot more polarized. And this is based on our own interpretation. There's nothing particularly scientific about this, but the climate ladder on the left is probably, if you've got a climate story, these are the titles that are probably not a bad home for them. And you can see there's more than those on the right. The net zero snake is probably where you're going to find more trouble getting those stories in, or they're going to be judged in a negative way, more likely. And that's not entirely true across the board, but it is definitely harder. And I would say the difference between the ones on the left, and we do mean the political left, I guess, partly, and the political right is separating these. But the other thing that's maybe separating them is on the titles on the left are thinking about what might happen to the planet, and the titles on the right might be considering more what might be happening to our own lives in the changes needed for the climate transition. So, and there are a few titles, and I put the express on both sides, Steph, and I think probably, largely down to the efforts of Steph. It's on that left-hand side as well, on the right. That would be my view. She'll probably tell you different, but I think I would say it's down to her that it sort of straddles both sides, and also the Times. And I think people would probably suggest maybe the Times is moving in the other direction, more towards the right. Certainly the leaders seem to give that impression. So I think that's probably a useful way of looking at these. Just as an example, the Telegraph this week wrote about net zero headlights, which turn out to be just normal LED headlights, which are a danger to other drivers. But yeah, I thought that was a great sort of example of how they kind of will see many stories through that particular lens of net zero, and so it's a difficult job to win them over in many cases. Yeah. So if we just move to the next slide. So this is done in 2024 and is a quick breakdown of media by voter intention. And I know it's quite small, but the interesting thing, so firstly, I'd say that like 1 in 6, I think, of voters said newspapers were their primary source of news. But that also means that they're also very I guess their influence extends considerably beyond that, and we could also debate about the impact these papers have on social media and an opinion in the Westminster bubble. But I think it's a good sort of reflection. So the top two for Labour are the Daily Mirror and the Guardian, Labour voters site, and for the Conservatives, the primary source, Daily Express and the Daily Mail. Interestingly, for Reform, the Telegraph way out in front. And I guess that kind of fits with what we were talking about at the previous slide, followed by the Daily Mail and Sun, and then the Lib Dems' Private Eye comes top. Who knew? Followed by the Independent Guardian. And just for those who are interested, and I know we were talking about the Green Party just before we started, that isn't listed, obviously, because it's pre-election and they have moved forward considerably since then. But other groups list iNews and The Observer as their top titles, so that might come into the Greens camp, I guess. And don't know, those voters who didn't know who they're going to vote for said the Daily Mail and the Telegraph. So obviously some of those tempted towards the right-wing perspective, but maybe not wanting to indicate how they voted. And just moving on to the next slide. So what I wanted to kind of consider is alternate lenses. So yes, if you're coming to papers with a climate story, you might find it's in one of those two bins, and so that'll make your choice. But based on those voter intentions, I think it's really useful to know how can we talk to those media titles that are harder to reach, and is there a different way of talking to them? And so a good example here is in the bottom right corner, which is a story we did with Ed Hawkins, who's the brilliant brain between the climate stripes, and we would keen to do something with him. He has amazing climate research, and the Daily Mail was a target of ours, and we wanted to get in to find a way to talk about climate without talking about climate. And the way we looked at it was royalty was a great topic for them that was of compelling interest. So we got Ed to have a look at the reigns of various monarchs leading back to Queen Victoria, and how much rain they'd had in each of their reigns. You can see where the sun pun's going, but it found, of course, that King Charles his reign has had by far the wettest climate of all, or wettest weather of all, and so that was a really useful barometer, and we actually, and we'll probably talk about this later. We had a graphical prepared with data that we'd checked thoroughly with Ed first, that they were able to break out and use each of the monarchs, and they gave it a great sort of double page spread, and they used it across Mail Online, and that was just, I guess, an example of how you can work to get something in using a different lens. So the lens of royalty, and using, I guess, perhaps weather as as instead of climate, would probably be what they were interested in, but pretty much it is climate. But that was just a way of kind of finding the subjects they like and using those as your way in. So likewise, in the middle story, the Sun, very big on skills and employment. They have a great employment editor, Jane Hamilton, who's really good, brilliant on LinkedIn. If you ever want tips for journos, for reaching journos, she'll be far better than me. She is absolutely hot on great tips every Monday. So look out for that. But so rather than trying to get them to write about something that we thought was perhaps hard, like installation, we went for telling the story of how you get those skills. And this is a fun company called Qbot, who use robots to deploy installation, and so they needed people with gaming skills. And so we did a great piece in the Sun, just to look at how you could get those skills, and the kind of job market there for those skills. So it's just a different twist, and that they've got they really want to help young people get into gainful employment, and they're thinking about economy and businesses that are growing fast. They like those. Another thing to mention with the Sun, just out of interest, although their main paper is quite dismissive of EVs, I think they probably have the best advocate for electric vehicles in their motoring editor, Rob Gill, who each week is sort of on a crusade to talk up EVs and how good they are, and that's because he just loves driving and he loves those cars. So just it's worth finding in these titles the areas that are useful. And on the right there, I just want to give an example that we used with the Telegraph, where we managed to get a full page in the business section about how Britain was going to be gas free for the first time this year, which was great. And we did have some concerns. We had some internal debate about whether or not to pitch this story to the Telegraph, but it went in absolutely pretty much as we'd conceived it, and was a real victory, I think, and shows that you can confound expectations. And I would say, so looking at the Telegraph, one of the things they are very hot on is power policy and energy. And also they are interested in other things too, I think, that are quite interesting. Like I've highlighted place-based journalism there. I think that's a really interesting niche. Obviously, farming, countryside, you'll find quite a lot of the titles that are to the right actually probably cover nature better than some of those on the left, which I find fascinating. But I think that you have to think it through a bit. But certainly countryside for the Telegraph, gardens and gardening, the RHS story I was talking about this week featured in the Daily Mail quite prominently, saying don't pave over your gardens, no artificial grass. We need to, we need to be wary of flooding and those sort of things. And then there are other sort of niche things. I think the Daily Mirror do a lot on wildlife trade, which is interesting. A subject like shipping is really of interest to the FT. And looking at the Times as well, obviously brilliant campaign on rivers, but clean air is increasingly a focus for them. So I think it's just useful to find your title, looking at what they might want or have written about in a particular way that might serve you, that helps. If it's been done before, it can be done again. So I think that's just a useful framing for people thinking about how do we escape the sort of polarized atmosphere of the earlier slide. And Nadia, if you could just spin forward. So I'm probably not telling you anything with these, just a bunch of names, and I could have filled this page with 30 or 40 people who would be really useful for you. Steph, obviously, great, brilliant campaigning journalist, and I think has been a great friend to the sector in many ways. And I think I would also include Nada at the Mirror, who's also done a lot of brilliant work personally, campaigning journalism, and Adam Vaughan quite often, even if your climate story doesn't get or environment story doesn't get in the paper, he will quite often write about it on LinkedIn, and they sort of personally, these are people that go quite a lot the extra mile to kind of help get stories in, and we need to support them, right? These people are our voice. And we need to be as helpful as we can. Fiona Harvey, just obviously a doyen of Fleet Street, I guess. And I put Rebecca Spears Cole. Emily Beeman is obviously a great advocate at PA, but Rebecca's come in as new, so I wanted to mention her. And I've added a couple of people there that you might, one person there and Stephen Swinford. You're probably not going to pitch any stories to him, but if you want to know what the government's thinking, quite often he will have the story first. And that's certainly been the case up to now. It may change with movements within Downing Street, but that seems to be a pretty solid way of reading, intuiting what the government's thinking. Victoria Seabrook doing amazing things at Sky, by the way, and as are all of these other people. Ben Spencer with his environment newsletter is also great. Matt Oliver, as I say, it's you might win some, you might lose some. Approach with caution, but he's a good journo on these issues. So I'm probably just telling you things you already know, but just reinforcing that these people, this gang, if you can get them on your side, they're they're really useful for any and all media, really. And then just flipping over, what are the things we can do to help journalists and to help get our stories in? And I think the primary thing I would say here is just journalists are so time pressed. They really have to move stories through quickly. They don't have the luxury of days of background reading or working up a story. So the more you can make things easy for them, and there are obviously pressures as well, financial pressures on papers and media that make things difficult. So the more you can do to make a story look like something that's going to go straight in the paper, the better, or straight on the website, wherever. And I think the one thing I would say in this is, like, do yourself a favor, know the media, know what know what your title is doing. So there's no point pitching a story if they've already written about it, or maybe they've written about it negatively and you don't know. There's an op-ed about it, there's a leader column about it. So I think the key one of the key things to do at the beginning of thinking about any story is just do the groundwork to understand what the title thinks and what they've written and how the writer writes what they're looking for, because that's that template of their drumbeat of stories will show you, that'll indicate where you can where you can put yourself and what kind of stories they're interested in. And then a couple of other quick points. Build interaction. I think if you end up, journalists' inboxes are just like hell. They are, they're full of unread emails, and people who come out of journalism like me, we look at people who have inboxes with no unread emails. Like, they're literally, if you're in a busy newsroom, you've got thousands of unread emails quite often, and you're just looking for the ones that really count. So you want to kind of find ways to have a conversation, because a lot of people, spamming you with relatively dud information, I would suggest. So the things that are interesting for a journalist would be, if somebody likes this story, Okay, just praise is a good way to to think about, oh, building a relationship. Also, journalists like to know when things are happening, and quite often they don't. So if you've got early intel on something, share it, and that will raise and share it with a subject line that says you're flagging something. Subject lines are your friend on this. Also, any gossip announcements. If there is something upcoming, and I should have said actually here, I would include reaction quotes. So if you've got a reaction to something, put reaction in the subheading. But because a journalist might go, oh, they're reacting to this story. I didn't even know it's happening. Or maybe other people are writing about this and I need to know. Okay. So they're super useful and they can help flag to a journalist that this is a story that's happening. But knowing ahead of time is really good. Also sharing anything that might be industry gossip, always loved, or important science or developments in the field. I think that helps with context for people. And the last thing I'd say in this sort of way of just building interactions is offer experiences. Offer so that you can people can't leave the newsroom for that many things. But if it's going to be fun, if it's going to be something they can be pictured doing, or at least they're going to meet some really interesting people within the sector, that they can really intensify their knowledge, then that's a great activity. And so, we all like to get out and about, and that's a really key way of building interaction. And then just a couple of other quick points. Make your story as good as you can. And one of those things is finding the key to unlocking interest. So if you tell people about a story, you often use the best form of words you can. So try and verbalize to somebody who has no interest in professional interest. Try and verbalize what the story is. Tell a friend, tell somebody who's outside your work, and see if you can encapsulate it in that. And then that's probably you're working into something that's more conversational, and then that's more likely to attract the average reader. So you do need to sort of edit yourself. Journalists don't want to be spammed. They don't want bad stories, so and they will think better of you if you can give them something good. And in that vein, let's think about advance warning that there's a story coming. Maybe think about the headline, some sort of what kind of quotes are going to be landed in there. So make it as copy ready as you possibly can. Um, and a great headline will take you a long way in these things. So think it through. Something that actually really fits the mold of the title you're looking for will help you hugely. And then lastly, just one other thing, um, and that is think for yourself in terms of organizations are dreadful in sort of group speak. And quite often they end up pushing subjects which don't really move the dial for an individual reader. So if you can think ahead of what you're delivering to media, think whether it translates into something for you. Step out, take your professional hat off, and think what would move the dial? What would I actually talk about? What How can I be more frank and more honest about it, or more provocative about it? And can I move my organization into that space? So yeah, those are just some quick tips. I hope it's useful. Happy to hear some questions later.
Thanks so much, Ben. Sorry, Steph. I'll just share your slides and we can move swiftly on.
And thanks so much for the kind words there, Ben. And good morning to everyone. I see a few names I recognize, and we've done stories together, so that's really nice. So I thought I would talk through my streams to begin with, because there's the one stream of the environment and the other one of kind of politics, and the two are obviously interlinked, but I just thought I'd use these two as quick examples. So the one with Fergal, I've used him just because he is an environmental figure, and that interview to go into kind of waterways. but it also shows the need for journalists to build relationships and why relationships matter in getting exclusives. And that relationship building can be key to getting really, really good stories. So if your organizations have access to anyone great as well, that's worth keeping in mind. And that makes a difference on the kind of coverage your story might get. The other one on state pensions, I just thought I'd include that to show that I do politics away from the environment. So that means I'll do things like Department of Work and Pensions, education, immigration. And sometimes people ask me, it's like, how does the divide work? How does that split? It's not like on Mondays, I'll do politics only, on Tuesdays, environments, then Wednesdays, we decide to do a bit of both. It's just as the news guards fall. So yesterday's a good example of the carbon budget delivery plan. That's an example of kind of politics and the environment coming together, and increasingly that happens. So a lot of my job is the two together, I think. So over to the next slide, please, Nadia. I thought I would kind of talk you through the lobby and what on earth that is, just while the next slides come up. So the parliamentary lobby, it's the political reporters that get special access. Before I move on to that though, just to go to Ben's points, forgot what the second slide was going to be. I'm really proud of the Express environmental coverage. And Ben, thank you so much for putting Express in both sides. It is something that Express puts a lot of investment in. So all of these trips are opportunities that I've been given abroad to highlight global issues of climate and nature crises. So I'm incredibly proud of that. The Express does put money into it. And today we gave like Boris Johnson taking aim, like a really good showing that had a page lead. So it is something we care about. Now on to the next slide. So the parliamentary lobby, it's the reporters that get to roam the corridors of power in Parliament. We do get special access to special advisors, to MPs, to the government's spokesman. So I just thought we can talk you through a day in the life. Sorry, Nadia, if you want to just hop over to the next slide. There we go. So understanding what a day in the life is like. Every day is different. There's no day that is the same, but I've tried my best to try and give you on average what most days are kind of like. And that means at about 8 a.m., I will start pulling together our news list. Now, for different publications, that news list time will be, creaking doors in Parliament, will come at different points in the day, right? So other papers will be far later. Ours is quite early. So editors go into conference at 9 a.m. So at 8 a.m., I start pulling together our news list. That is really important for you guys to know what times conferences are for various publications, because you have a better chance of getting a good showing if you can get in before that morning conference. And it needs to be enough time so that us journalists can come back and ask you guys questions to preempt the questions we know our editors will have, if that makes sense. So you don't want to go to, so I very often, for instance, will get really good pitches at like midday or even sometimes 3 p.m. with the midnight embargo. Your chances of getting a good showing at that point are quite slim. So timing is important. So 8 a.m. news list, that'll be through to the news editors by about 9. I'm usually in Parliament by 10. And between 10 and 11, I think there is huge value in coffees, in lunches, in meeting people face to face. So I think, and for lobby reporters, that can be more difficult sometimes, but if you can get any face to face time, do it and make it easy. So make it a coffee right by Parliament if you're trying to get the lobby on board. Help and make it just half an hour, not an hour, as close as you can. All of that just helps make it easy. So I try to get those in the morning very often. At about 11:30 every day, the Prime Minister's spokesman will do a lobby briefing. So we will march to Downing Street, and the man currently will sit there and answer all the questions we have, and he can't get up until he's answered all our questions. That happens twice a day. So after about, that kind of ends in midday, slightly after, depending on how many questions we're pelting him with. And in that afternoon, but before afternoon lobby is again more lunches, more coffees, calling people up, starting to pull stories together. And then afternoon lobby, it was just slightly more informal than the morning one. It's usually shorter, and then writing stories up in the afternoon as well. I think the reason why relationships with the lobby matter is because we can put a story that we maybe wrote about the day before or will be writing about that day straight to the Prime Minister's spokesman. That helps elevate it slightly up the agenda, and based on what the spokesman's response is, that could impact kind of showing on a page. So it means that you are getting your policy asks, for instance, right in front of Downing Street, which is quite good. And very often, I think you will find that stories that start out as like any other environment story, once they kind of, or any story, once they kind of ramp up, the lobby gets involved. So you bring in the political editor, the policy editor. So it starts with the specialist, but once MPs kind of start getting involved, it just ups that profile. And the lobby does tend to get a lot of front pages. So not for every single publication, but I would argue the majority. So, and that's because we're talking to MPs, special advisors. There is that in. And just to Ben's point, something I just want to talk to you guys here about the demands that journalists are facing, right? Newsrooms are getting squeezed and squeezed, and the pressure that is on journalists is just increasing. So we have live blogs to do, paper, websites, analysis pieces, videos, and on and on and on. So if you can make your pitches clear and as helpful as possible, that is amazing. So then in terms of how to build relationships with the lobby, I think something to consider is that the lobby are not environment specialists, right? So kind of getting into like the nitty-gritty of decarbonization or emissions straight off the bat is not the way to kind of get the lobby on board. The lobby cares about policy, cares about kind of infighting or where there might be a row. And if you can, to Ben's point, come to us and say, I've heard this, it hasn't been reported, or I'm hearing this party's considering this, or if the government were to do X, Y, Z on their planning and infrastructure bill, there has this ramifications. The lobby does care about the policy implications. And so to Ben's point, any kind of information you can bring to us that you would know, let's say from meetings with government, for instance, that you might be unhappy with, but depending on the paper, that would work quite well, right? And obviously sources are always protected. So that's one way of kind of getting to know the lobby, I think. And so I think just getting to know the lobby means ramping up potentially the coverage it gets. We will bring in MPs and just kind of up that profile slightly. I would say the approach between political reporters and specialists is different. So both kind of care about the nitty-gritty, I guess, policy concerns. But on the lobby side, less interested in, let's say, visits to a recycling factory, less interested potentially, not always, but in maybe case studies, because they will kind of bring in the MPs as like on the human side, and less lobby reporters, not heavy on the jargon and technical points, I think, generally. Specialists, you guys will probably deal with specialists, so there's more, you can get more into like the nitty gritty of it. I would also say obviously there's a difference between kind of tabloids and board sheets, and I think I'm quite rare to have the environment specialism in the lobby, but there are other lobby reporters who cover environmental issues, who might focus on kind of energy or have departments. So it's worth finding out for each publication who those journalists are and trying to get to know them. I wouldn't necessarily advise kind of getting to know the political editor of every single publication. But I know a lot of publications have assigned a department, let's say Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, to a reporter. So if you pick up that there is someone in the lobby who's doing a lot on energy, for instance, get to know them. And to Ben's point, so I think it's fair to say that publications on the right probably do nature more than the climate side. The two are inextricably linked, but sometimes nature, for instance, is a more helpful springboard because it's less policy. It's more something you can see, right? It's tangible. That's a good springboard into then talking about the climate stuff. So I don't think there's mutually exclusive. I think you can bring both into a story for sure. So that's something to keep in mind, I think. And then in terms of what journalists do and don't want, I think Ben kind of went through most of that, but I think the relationship absolutely does help, and we do want relationships with PRs, with organizations. So the best way of doing that is good stories. It always comes, and like exclusives, if it's an FOI, if you're hearing something, that's the best way of doing it. I also just want to very quickly talk about kind of trends in the lobby. And the nice thing is about this parliament, so you all have an opportunity to bring the environment more to the fore, because it is something that has come to the fore more under this government. There is more talk of energy, and I mean, Steve Reed was talking a lot about sewage and rivers. And I think as we head towards the next general election, I don't think that's going to change, because it is net zero, for instance, is becoming such a hot potato issue. So there will be so many more opportunities, and you can all help the lobby bring balance in. So my finding is very often people will try to sidestep specialists and get weird and wonderful stories in via the lobby, because there's that lack of expertise. And if you are on top of that, and Nadia, if you go to the next slide, and you can please and be proactive in kind of, if you know there's a report out there that is dodgy, message the lobby and let us know. Definitely, please. And so I think, and this kind of goes back to the difference between specialists and the lobby, but being proactive versus reactive. Maybe with dealing with the lobby, you have to be slightly more reactive, reacting to reports or something an MP said, new government announcement, or the budget, for instance. That's a really good way. If you can be punchy, if you can be quick, there's always a swathe of announcements in the budget that the lobby works up. That's really good. And then I guess the specialist is the more proactive side, in that, do you want to come for a visit to our rainforest, or do you want to, so it works slightly differently, I think. And I'm just conscious of time. But I would say you need a bit of both. But yeah, just get to know the reporters, I think, is key, and what we cover. But yeah, happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Steph. Yeah, fantastic insights, really helpful. And sorry about the slow slide changing at the beginning. I lost my mouse, but anyway, yeah, we're into the Q&A part of this session. So please feel free to pop questions in the chat, or preferably use the raise hand function on Zoom if you prefer. Just give it a minute to sort of let the information sink in if needed. Yeah, Tom.
Hi there. Yeah, really helpful. I actually don't work in like the media side. I'm actually in the policy side. So I just wanted to come along and learn more about like that aspect, because I think policy and like parliamentary affairs teams are really bad sometimes at like giving stuff to our media colleagues. So I guess so my question's on that point, like, you know, if we're in the space of writing policy reports, is there any tips on kind of like converting that? Any general tips? I mean, I guess it depends a lot on the story, but in converting that to something that's actually interesting to the media as opposed to just interesting to wonks, basically.
Maybe I'll start on this, and Ben, come in if you want to. But I'm going to pick on something that Ben actually said. But humans care about humans, not necessarily nitty-gritty policy. So at the Express, if you're talking about energy, and Ben made this point, people care about how it impacts people's lives, right? So that might be energy bills. I would say take the policy and think about how it impacted, say, Doris in North Yorkshire. What does this for her? Try and make it as human as possible. And basically, what are you asking people to do differently, or how are they going to be able to interact with the new technology differently as a result of your ask? Are you urging the Prime Minister, for instance, to do something? That's a much easier way of kind of zooming out and just making it about people. I think that's key, and I think that sometimes gets lost when we're talking about nitty-gritty energy things, for instance. It's just it loses the humanness, and especially like if you're talking with a tabloid and you're trying to get coverage across a range of publications, then that humanness definitely helps.
Yeah, and just further to that, that's a great answer, Steph. I think the other thing I would consider is just how do you build anticipation for something? How do you, because the moment a report is, launched, then that's great. But actually, if people know about these things in advance, journalists generally, they need a heads up as to what they're doing, ahead of time. And so I think building anticipation, and for us working in broadcast also, it's thinking about who are you going to put out who's going to be your expert, who's going to be able to make this into something that's going to be a subject of broadcast interest. And quite often that is the policy person. It quite they're the person who's done the research, and it can be the comms person. But I think that's really useful. And also just I would also suggest the more you can create anticipation. LinkedIn's your friend around some of these things about making things, getting the gang of people who you work with alongside colleagues in that same sector to kind of talk about it. Then that, they're what's happening, and also breaking it down for people so it's as simple as possible. I think that's super useful.
And sorry, actually, one more thing on that as well. Case studies is really good. So if you have someone with a lived experience who's struggling with whatever policy announcement you're trying to then bring in, again, human, and also and Ben's sparked the light bulb. But if so, you can get MPs or like CEOs or a celebrity to endorse what you're calling for. That helps kind of take it away from the policy wonk world.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Great question. Rashina.
Hiya, one for Steph. Less so you touched on it this time around, but I went to a panel event you did with Rox Hill, and you talked about supplementing pictures of like digital marketing assets. And I just wondered exactly like what you envisioned within that, like whether it's photos or like video content. Yeah.
So I think you need to think that like news outlets now operate across multiple platforms. So very often I might talk in print terms, but really when I'm writing on stories, doing visits, I'm thinking pictures. In the age of, social media, it's all about video really at the moment. And that means YouTube Shorts, Instagram Reels, longer things on YouTube. So that is key. So if you can ramp up, so very often, and it happens less so, but I think there's an opportunity here for everyone on the call. Very often we get in press releases pictures. Now that is key. That will help you, especially in a tabloid. If it's a really strong picture, helps get a bigger showing. It takes up more space on a page. That's brilliant. But you want your story to go on TikTok, for instance, too, right? So I think it's worth ramping up the inclusion of videos in the assets that you send over to journalists. And that means just put a Dropbox folder with, I think, both the option for vertical and horizontal. And it can be pre-edited. It doesn't have to be. I think my only word of caution on this would be it can't feel like an advertorial. So we're not going to put something that's like a promotion, right? But if it's, let's say you're sending over a quote, maybe you get the person being quoted to video themselves saying the quote, send that over. And that's potentially something that a journalist could do a piece to camera to and slot in, for instance. But it's worth thinking about things as a holistic package for print and online for sure.
I would just add to that, Rashina, that we're seeing that people get a bit more traction with reactions to stories. So actually broadcasters see that and they think, oh, that's, you've got a strong reaction to a story and you're a spokesperson. You can send a quote and that's good, but use that quote, put that quote online, and that will be your sort of showcase that, people like us can find it, or that, politicians will engage with, or that broadcasters will see and go, hey, that's somebody we want. Because, in the end, sending over a reaction quote is a bit bland. It doesn't have enough, and having a bit of personality behind it really helps. So I would recommend that as an approach too.
Thanks, Rashina. Yeah, Annie.
Sorry, I just realized as I did that my mic was up. Hi, thank you both so much. That was really, really useful. I think we didn't really mention it much today, but I was just thinking about local media, and I know that one of the actions that a lot of climate groups often do is sort of a letter to editor, get people in the local area to write to them. Just wondered if you had thoughts on kind of how best to make use of some of those local sources, or whether letters to editor in general are something that you kind of engage with or find useful.
We definitely see it being useful. I think, and to Steph's point, if there's a political action that's taken in a joint letter by a number of parties, and this works both locally and nationally, can be quite effective. You have to choose the title, but also, if you've got a number of brands and organizations or collective number of people represented, it is quite strong, and it shows some power, and if it shows organization as well. And I think that then tips off to people that this is a story that's got legs. So it probably works in a number of ways, not only the fact that, somebody was asking me about this the other day, about how do I respond to a particular reform councillor, and I said, why don't you respond in email and then CC in the letter, to the local newspaper and a couple of journalists you think would be interested in, and make that a public letter. And I think that works, and that certainly works. The more people and the more organizations you have attached to that. And certainly in the NGO world, I see that being used when there's something fundamental at stake, and you suddenly see a bunch of names, and this works locally as well. You suddenly see a bunch of names going, hey, you've got this wrong. I do think that's important, and it does translate into news anyway. So it's not just the letter. Don't think about that as a static thing. It's actually, it's a news event for people. So I would almost flag that to people that you're going to do it again. Just that this is coming out tomorrow, and anticipation is key in these things.
Thanks, Annie. I can't see any more questions for now, so I might just ask one of my own in case, and please do keep questions coming if you have them. But I wondered if you could, but for both of you, touch on a bit more, sort of speak to how to develop relationships, especially perhaps where individuals, organisations don't really hold relationships with people in the media, and sort of if you can give some tips about how they can be seen as sort of credible voices with those media outlets, and yeah, build better relationships.
Shall I start, Ben? So if you have absolutely no relations with anyone in the media, I think don't necessarily aim for the most senior person in the newsroom, I think is where I would start. And bear in mind that if you go to someone junior, they're also probably more willing to really, really, really put in the work. They want to impress editors too. They might have fewer stories on their plate and kind of give yours maybe more time of day. And also that journalist is going to rise in the ranks. So yeah, don't necessarily go for like the political editor or even the environment editor. Go for an environmental reporter, correspondent. And I know newsrooms, again, people are getting cut left, right, and center, so it's less hierarchical, but there's no harm in going for someone more junior, I think, as a starting point, and you can climb the ranks together, if you will. Ultimately, a journalist is going to entertain a good story, and I would just focus on the output that you're giving to journalists. If you are reliable, trustworthy, fast, and consistently delivering high value, it is in a journalist's interests to engage and get to know you. And your story, your reaction, your punchiness, your ability to deliver will be an incredible tool for any journalist, and that will make you indispensable. And to Ben's point, we do absolutely get 1,001 emails a day. But I'm pretty good. I look at every single one. So I think if you can get into the inbox and like not frustrate the system, and by that I mean if you don't hear back from a journalist, follow up once and then just accept that they probably have seen it, because I think most journalists are actually pretty okay with our inboxes. Just accept that it's just maybe not one for them, and move on. Don't follow up kind of 4 times, track them down on WhatsApp. I would also say, do pick up the phone and call. Journalists, I think we have a reputation of being scary, but if you've never dealt with the media, call up the newsroom and just say, and introduce yourself and say, who's the best person to kind of pitch a green story to? There's nothing wrong with jumping on the phone. It doesn't happen much these days. I think a lot of people are scared to speak to journalists or just don't like phone calls, but I'm a big advocate of them, and I would say do them, and it's such an easy way. And also, like, you get to hear people's tone of voice. It's way more human than an email. But it's Ben.
The only thing I'd add to that, I think that's absolutely right, and Steph has shamed me. I'm ashamed of my email etiquette there. But the only thing I'd add is, like, the best contacts are often made out of work hours. So if you're going to go to an event, go to the things that, you know, move the dial in the sectors you're in, and you will find the journalists are there. You know, they need to go. That's important for them. And then it's just saying hello. And most people will give you give you the time of day and be really flattered to know that you've recognized them and that you've shown an interest. So I think you can't beat meeting people in person. And actually, if you go to these things, quite often it's just a small circle of people that are, that you need to know. Or that you get to know quite quickly, and then you start, feeling like you've got those contacts because there's a personal relationship there, and I think that really helps.
Yeah, thanks. Great answers. Although the thought of calling a newsroom is quite terrifying, but good to know that might work. But Alex. I don't think we can hear you, Alex. But I can see your microphone's off. Perhaps, would you mind typing your question in the chat, and I'm happy to read it out. But while you do that, there's a question from Francesca in the chat, which is, I guess a related question is identifying the right person, as it's often hard to know who might be most relevant. But I guess calling for the newsroom is the best answer for that. Yes, Steph.
I think calling up newsroom, yes, absolutely. But, and Ben mentioned this, there is a cyclical nature to news. So chances are, whatever you're pitching, some kind of that on a theme would have been published before by the publication, more likely than not. So just try and look up who that person was. And also, I mean, we do talk to each other. So even if it's kind of misdirected, if it's a strong story, we would then pass that on to a colleague. I would say the thing you maybe don't want to do is fire it off to 4 people at the Express, for instance, because you don't know to come to me, but then not tell us that you've then sent it off to 4 people. Because if I pick it up and I'm really keen on it, I don't know that, let's say, a colleague spotted it before me and is now working on it. So I wouldn't start pitching like multiple people at once because you're unsure. Either call the newsroom or this like knowledge of the publication, and just kind of a quick search even online should be able to help give you a general steer of who might be a good person to go to.
Thanks, Steph. I can't see the question come up from Alex. Maybe it was one of those that needs to be spoken rather than. Oh, never mind. It's coming. So picking up on Ben's point on offering experiences to build relationships, I would love to hear examples of interesting ones you've been on.
So does that mean like experiences of, well, I mean, like as opposed to that aren't lunches and coffees. I mean, sometimes people will message. I've had one saying, "Do you want to go for a manicure together?" Well-intentioned. Ben is laughing. I can see that. Well-intentioned, and maybe like a lifestyle journalist might be more up for that. Probably not the vibe, right? Memorable, but probably not the thing we're going to go for. There's something out there that's just not a site visit, as exciting as those can be. Goodness, I like a site visit. Let me tell you why. Because you get to spend a lot of time with people, and it is usually quite memorable. If I've taken the time to go and do something, then it usually will always result in a story. You get to spend a few hours, get to meet a lot of people. But I don't know, maybe Ben has another answer.
I mean, and I've seen you've been on some wonderful trips overseas, Steph. So obviously an overseas trip to see something is just absolutely amazing, and quite often does buy you that space in the newspaper. But there are a lot of simple things that and I remember when a couple of firms were launching electric bikes, they called us out, same with various cars, you get to try and test. There are quite often I actually remember diving at the London Aquarium in a shark tank with which was particularly memorable, and not everyone's going to say that, but I think sometimes it can be just, I mean, if you've got, and I noticed there was a great story about the Wildlife Trust wanting to buy a big piece of nature yesterday on Radio 4. You know, let's get a journalist up there. You know, get them to walk around it, give them a week's notice that this is going to be something that's important. Or if there's a really big solar farm that you want to feel strongly that this is we need to win the local community over, then get the journalist to have a look and see and go around and talk to people, and then and make sure that that they're not just going to fire off without having some experience of the site or the place. So, and a lot of the best stories are quite place-based. So, we went to to Clacton, went ahead of Nigel Farage's vote, and it was really interesting to see the number of poor houses, the number of houses that weren't well insulated because they were sort of ex-Ford factory workers and those sort of things, and what were the issues there. So I think offering people experiences in places that you're going to talk about, and it might be losing what's happening in Luton and car plants or those sort of things. Journalists, I think, if they think they're getting a little bit of an exclusive access to something ahead of time, will go, great. Okay, that's something I've got, and I'll be there, and I'll look, and I can talk authoritatively, and I can probably record something, and I've got some images, and you've set up some people. That just makes them look so smart and tuned in. So I, it's not probably not. Steph would say the commitments for lobby reporter probably don't allow that so easily, but certainly with a specialist, I would, get somebody to the town where they're talking about it or where they've made a breakthrough.
And can I just also say one thing? The other thing I'd add really quickly is not quite around an experience, but engage genuinely with journalists on social media. So I have a professional Instagram account, LinkedIn, for instance, and I read every single comment. There's one lady who has moved over from LinkedIn to engaging on Instagram. And if she ever lands in my inbox with a pitch, I know her name, and I know that she has an awareness of what stories I'm putting out there, and that we do notice that. So I would also say genuinely engage outside of the inbox on social media. There's a lot in that, and it's quite an underutilized tool, I think.
Yeah, super. Thanks both so much. And I think Annie's quite keen to read the story about the Shark Tank, so perhaps I can share the link on to that story. But that does bring us nicely to the end of this webinar, and sadly, also the end of the Boost webinar series. So just to say massive thank you to Ben and Steph for being here today. And also to our audience for some really great questions, and yeah, we'll share the recording and the digital guide around shortly, as well as the feedback form as usual. But otherwise, thanks again, and see you all again soon, hopefully.
Thank you.
Thanks.